let me start by thanking Green Cross for this kind invitation and apologizing that I couldn't be there with you in person. I am now in the final stages of a PhD in international water law at Xiamen University in China. And my research topic is the community of interest doctrine, which is what I would like to talk to you about today. And what I'm trying to do is to develop a better understanding of the theory and practice of how community of interest has been applied and implemented around the world in transboundary basins. And what I found is that in many places there's a balancing between limited territorial sovereignty and community of interests, including elements of unilateralism, whether lawful or unlawful, coordination and joint action, with the emphasis on each type of state behavior varying across basins and regions and through time. So first important message, community of interest doesn't mean a departure from limited territorial sovereignty. It really means taking limited territorial sovereignty one step further. So community of interest transcends the focus of limited territorial sovereignty on restricting the rights of riparian states to use the watercourse. Where necessary to meet common interests, it implies basin-wide joint action, and where states can go beyond where necessary, places in evidence the benefits of positive and long-term cooperation. So the idea would be to integrate joint action into unilateral plans to tackle common interests and enable equitable and reasonable use, so that in pursuing unilateral projects, states don't sacrifice their common interests and where possible, proactively work together to achieve them. What do I mean when I talk about common interests? Let's use the Amazon fisheries resources to illustrate. And let me paint you a picture in that regard. So we know over 2,000 fish species in the Amazon, many of which are vital for local livelihoods and diets. But among the key species for the sector, most are threatened or have not even been assessed. At the same time, most Amazon protected areas have been designed and are managed with the focus on terrestrial ecosystems, and they don't duly consider the protection of aquatic biodiversity. At the same time, we know that free-flowing rivers that retain overall connectivity are essential for migratory species such as the mighty Dorado catfish. So what would community of interest imply in a situation like that? It would call for states to come together to identify the fish that is most important, pinpoint those most threatened, and then come together to devise possible solutions which could include protected areas or the maintenance of free-flowing rivers. So let me just give you a little bit of background in terms of my research justification, why I've started looking into community of interest in the first place. So let's think about the modern water challenge and in an increasingly interdependent world. And we know that this challenge is far from being resolved. If anything, it has become more daunting over the years. And in international watercourses, the challenge is compounded because you have several states, sovereign nations within a single natural system. Cooperation there, and we know that, is essential as states strive to meet that challenge. But what kind of cooperation? Historically, law has played a key role in informing and supporting transboundary water cooperation. But is traditional international water law as centered on limited territorial sovereignty up to that challenge? To what extent are co-basin states already building on common interests and shared risks to engage in deeper and positive cooperation? And if so, is it possible to argue that state practice has been progressing beyond notions of coexistence and simple coordination and unilateral restraint to embrace the ideas behind community of interests? So with this bit of factual background, let's go into the legal nitty-gritty. Scholarship has identified over history 4 theories underlying international water law. And in short, there's widespread acceptance among states that international law rejects claims of absolute control and requires that the interests of neighboring nations and the protection of the environment are duly considered in compliance with the norms of equitable and reasonable use and harm prevention, within the framework of limited territorial sovereignty. But then we look at community of interest, which takes that a step further. The doctrine's essence is the physical unity of shared waters, which inevitably brings together all the riparian states, which within a basin as a community. And such states share interdependencies and interests in the sustainable use, management, and protection of the resource and related ecosystems. So just to give you an example, in the case of the Plata Basin, the treaty identifies as the overarching common interest the basin's harmonious development and physical integration, and then it breaks that down into specific interests such as navigation, biodiversity, and even beyond the water sector. So now that we have this broad, perhaps a bit esoteric idea of community of interest, let's try to go a little bit deeper and assess what it's really made of. And that's what I refer to as the normative content. What are the legal elements behind community of interest? And we will see that some of those elements are present in the Plata and Amazon basins already. The first element is a basin approach, which means management of water and related resources that takes the drainage basin or a sub-basin as the basic, though not necessarily exclusive, hydrobiogeographic unit for planning. And in very pragmatic terms, what does that mean? Involvement of all co-basin states. And that's the case in both the Plata and Amazon regimes. The second and third elements are basin agreements and basin bodies. What do I mean by that? A treaty among all basin states within a catchment or subcatchment, and which steps up and institutionalizes cooperation under the umbrella of a joint body. And thereby it formalizes the community of interest in question. So the Plata Basin Treaty, for example, was concluded to establish firmer institutional arrangements for cooperation. So one open question here, what about non-binding instruments like declaration or memorandums of understanding? And from state practice, it seems that those non-binding instruments are often viewed as stepping stones towards the formalization of the community, even if they might incorporate already some elements of the doctrine. So let's use the recent Pantanal Declaration as an example. There, it doesn't specifically refer to a basin approach, but it implicitly embraces the approach because it refers to various elements of the idea behind it. So it talks about the mutual dependence between Pantanal and Plata Basin water resources, natural interconnectivity as an enabler of the integration process, the whole of the Paraguay Basin as the basic planning unit, the integrated management of water and biodiversity, and finally, the maintenance of ecosystem connectivity. All these elements are part of a drainage basin approach. And then with respect to treaties and bodies, the declaration refers to the future adoption of an agreement that would foresee the establishment of a joint body and would call for the development of an integrated vision for the Pantanal as part of the broader Paraguay Basin, and which would specify a series of cooperative actions. So again, the declaration as a stepping stone towards formalization, and also this aspect introduces the fourth element of the doctrine, which is joint action. So what do I mean by joint action? It means all of the basin states concerned, when managing, protecting, and developing the basin, doing so jointly, at least where appropriate, and if possible, make joint action the rule rather than the exception. So in the Plata Basin Treaty, there's a reference to joint action tools. So the idea of joint exercises to identify areas of common interest, or joint projects, plans, and studies. And also states coming together to negotiate specific protocols and agreements or other operational arrangements. In the Pantanal Declaration also reflects elements of joint action. It talks about management and use founded on collaboration and integration, including through joint mechanisms and instruments, and then working on topics such as environmental flows and protected areas and connectivity, and research as a basis for conservation. So just to illustrate a little bit of how joint action happens in concrete terms, the recent Jeff Amazon project and the element of the project focused on the trilateral map region. There, in the past decades, there have been more frequent extreme events, so more prolonged droughts and huge floods. So the project brought the states together, the three states, to assess the vulnerability and adaptive capacity of local water resources, and designed and implemented a trinational early warning system. This system now serves as a joint platform for monitoring, analysis, and alerts. And it already has had very concrete implications. In the historic floods of the Rio Acre in 2015, the early warning system was successfully used to the benefit of thousands of local people. The final element, and which may sound the most abstract of all five, I see it, if not a legal, at least as an ethical foundation. So solidarity as a basis for water allocation and benefit sharing that transcends the weighing of factors under equitable and reasonable use. So it calls not only for unilateral restraint, but also for compromise, where you have a community of basin states faced with specific competing interests, even though they retain that overarching common interest in the water course as a whole. In case law, solidarity has been used as or viewed as a basis, for example, for the joint financing of pollution control measures. And as abstract as the idea may seem, the Plata Basin Treaty contains an explicit reference to solidarity. So it talks about states joining forces to achieve common interests, guided by a strong spirit of solidarity and cooperation, and to protect future generations, which is another aspect of solidarity. In its turn, the Pantanal Declaration refers to the principle of cooperation in accordance with national circumstances, capabilities, and financial possibilities. So that idea of taking into account the specifics of each country is also reflected in equity, but also has a part to play under solidarity. So now that we know, get a better understanding of what community of interest entails, it becomes clear that it's not something for the future. In fact, elements of the community of interest doctrine are already underlying the implementations of widely accepted obligations under international water law. So to illustrate, under both the Plata Basin Treaty and the Pantanal Declaration, joint action agreements and joint bodies are viewed as legal tools to enable compliance with equitable and reasonable use and harm prevention. So without that, on all this focus on community of interest, that doesn't mean that limited territorial sovereignty no longer has a role to play. After all, we know that unilateral projects will still be implemented. Just think about the numerous plans, the numerous dams that are planned for within Latin America, with potentially transboundary implications. And these aren't just abstract considerations. We know about the impacts that dams can have on transboundary waters. In the Amazon, for example, local fisheries underscore the decline in abundance of the pacu after the construction of the Tucuruí Dam. So not a criticism to the dam, but just to say these are real concerns. These are things that states need to take into consideration. And on that aspect, experts note that often dams have played a key role in causing tensions between riparian states. When we look to the future, when water may become less available, the demand will increase. It's quite likely that mega projects will play an even stronger role in causing tensions among riparian states. So there's a need to assess on a case-by-case basis the possible impact of the construction of mega dams and other infrastructure on interstate relations. And what experience shows is that it matters how these dams are planned and constructed. And at the same time, there will be increased likelihood of tensions and impacts in basins where governance is weak, meaning where treaties and bodies, resilient agreements and operational bodies are missing. So that leads me to the conclusion there's a need to assess, for our region, for Latin America, there's a need to assess the robustness of existing agreements to deal with rapid change and to consider the value of the elements behind community of interests in basins not covered by any agreements at this point. And that would be in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. Under the Go on Water, there's an indicator that measures the extent to which transboundary basins around the world are covered by treaties and agreements. So to illustrate, to bring that back to our context, both the Plata and the Amazon treaties make clear that cooperation is without prejudice to unilateral projects. And then they go ahead and say, well, these projects will still remain bound by international law. And they stop there. They don't specify any further what the rules of the game are. Why this gap is something is noteworthy. Let's recall the from a few years ago, the Madeira Dam controversy. So at the time, Brazil and Bolivia engaged in an ad hoc diplomatic process, but legal gaps and ambiguities caused problems for both countries. For Bolivia, it wasn't clear to which mechanisms to resort to enforce its alleged rights and to discuss the possibility of transboundary impacts. But also for Brazil, the diplomatic consultations took place without any criteria in terms of mutual duties and a maximum duration. So with no specific date to end, negotiations delayed implementation, eventually increased uncertainty around completion date, raising the project's overall costs. So in such a scenario, which is bound to become more frequent in the future, clearer rules and procedures would have offered a template for information exchange, consultations, and negotiations, avoiding legal uncertainty, political instability, and unnecessary delays. At the end of such a process, at a date that both countries would be aware of, Brazil would have been able to move ahead with implementation with confidence of having acted with due diligence, which is a requirement under international law. And Bolivia, for its part, would have been given a reasonable opportunity to present its concerns, ask for clarifications, and propose solutions. So to sum up and offer you some final thoughts. On limited territorial sovereignty, I think now is a good time to recall a recent case between Costa Rica and Nicaragua, where the International Court of Justice reaffirmed the duty to conduct transboundary environmental impact assessment where there's a danger of significant harm, and rendered the first compensation decision for environmental damage to a wetland caused by unlawful activities. This decision raises the stakes for countries planning major water projects, and it reinforces the relevance of the global water conventions in South America and beyond. And it makes me question and ask you if it may be time to embrace the global water conventions as stepping stones towards strengthening existing treaties and towards formalizing smaller and yet important basin communities in the region where cooperation appears to be less advanced. On community of interest, we saw that there are elements already present in the region to varying degrees, including in terms of implementation, and still missing in most transboundary basins, especially transboundary aquifers. So there's an opportunity here to build on lessons learned within the region and beyond, and then apply this to strengthening cooperation and ensuring that the common interests of the basin states in each watershed are preserved and are met. So with this, I thank you. Muito obrigada. Muchas gracias.